My name is Tim Quinlan. I'm a research associate at Bird. I'm covering this session, planning fieldwork. Some of you may not actually be doing fieldwork. I'm not sure if everybody here is. You might be economists working with big data sets. But really what I'm talking about is planning your research, and for fieldwork, as the case may be. The bias is towards those who are doing fieldwork in some way. But you're going to go out and speak to people. You're not going to just sit behind a computer analyzing the data sets. Okay. The other aspect of this talk is it's about giving you some guidelines. And I'm trying to make it very practical. In essence, how to think about working out your research plan or your plan for doing fieldwork. Okay? So, Prof. Whitman has covered everything up to now. He covered the easy part. I'm covering the hard part. Okay? Because planning fieldwork takes time, it takes effort. It's not a matter of saying, okay, I've got my concept paper, I've got my proposal. Oh yeah, I'll go out and do some interviews. Or a friend of mine says, no, also just throw in some focus group discussions, they're good. It's not as simple as that. Okay? And that's what I want to show you. And I want to try and provide very practical ways of thinking about how to go about it. And by the way, feel free to stop me whenever you want, if you have any questions. By way of introduction, what Prof. Whitman has covered up to now is, from your concept note, your research, how you go about devise your research question, you're testing the hypothesis, you've got a concept note. That's the strategy part of your thesis. It's what you want to do. You want to test this hypothesis. You want to answer this question. And when I talk about planning for fieldwork or doing a research plan, it's how you actually go about to do it. It's a plan. I don't know sort of why, so it's just sometimes useful to keep a distinction between strategy and plan. Okay, in reality, they do overlap. It's like why I never like the word strategic plan, because it kind of confuses us. Strategy is what you want to do, the plan is how you're going to do it. And we're focusing very much now on the how part. Okay, how to do my research. Where do you start? And like everything else, you're faced with a blank computer screen or a blank piece of paper and you think, I don't know what to do. I want to cover three simple steps, three things that you can do. One is look at the references that you used in your literature review. Just want to check. Remember Prof. Whitman, I think on the first day, said, when you're trying to do a PhD thesis, you read a lot. You read in depth, you read analytically. A lot of your attention is focused on who else has done research in this field, what have they found out. But, I said read in depth. One of the things you should also look at is how did they do it. So on articles, look at the methods section. Other people may have done research on the same topic, even on the same issue. You can ask yourself, how did they do it? Can I do the same way? Can I do my study the same way they did theirs? Articles are not always the best source for finding that out. If you've got a research topic where there's been research reports conducted by consultants, government researchers, whatever, they're very good. PhD theses on the same topic, because they'll have details of, they have a whole chapter in much more detail than what you'll see in an article on the methods. It's a starting point. Bear in mind that quite often you're doing a topic that you may be focusing on this issue, but you're saying you're doing this issue because nobody else has covered it. So you may be able to use some of the methods that they use. You may even able to use some of their questions. So again, look at the methods section as a starting point. How did other people do it? Can I do it the same way? If not, why not? These are sort of questions you just got to ask yourself every time. And if you're saying, look, if you've asked yourself, look, I can't do the study the same way, what's the appropriate alternative? And that's where you need a supervisor. A supervisor, you can discuss these things with your supervisor. As I'm saying, I'm not going to get into huge detail. I'm giving you guidelines to think about how to get started with planning your fieldwork. Okay.
A key thing.
Keep in mind the distinction between methodology and method. Okay. You'll often people write section methodology and methods. They confuse everything. Methodology is the logic of your study. I can't even see my own writing on there, so I have to just remind myself here. Okay, yeah. In a way, methodology is how you, what I've tried to put it simply, is how you approach it. Method is how you apply that logic in practice. And it's important to keep that distinction. I appreciate in reality that, for example, we've all gone through undergraduate years, actually it's secondary school, we've learned that there is scientific method. There is sometimes confusion in the way people use the term. Scientific method is a particular logic of examining the world out there. But these days, people make a very clear distinction between methodology and method, because the way science has grown, particularly in the social sciences, there's an enormous number of different techniques and tools and even methodologies, given the rise of psychology, marketing, even, for example, some of you from economics management would know social marketing. Social marketing is the application of a whole lot of different varieties of methodologies from the social sciences into the field of marketing. So we make a clear distinction. Methodology is the logic. Method is how you apply it. There is then a connection. Why I'm saying you can't just go out and say, I'm going to do utilities. The method, tools, the instruments that you use are logically related back. They stem to the methodology. There's a rationale for using it. So you have a methodology, you then have to use the right method that fits in with that methodology. Any questions so far? Okay, there's another thing that quite often, I've seen a lot of PhD theses, and you're often encouraged to, you have your core research question, which is what you're trying to answer, and then you often have to set out objectives or subsidiary research questions. There's a logic to that, usually. The logic is, if you answer the answers to all the subsidiary questions collectively, you'll give you the answer to the core research question. So just as a way, when you're trying to plan your fieldwork, the subsidiary questions are often much more practical questions related, but start to tie in where you're going to do the study, who you're going to do the study with. Just think. Bear in mind, remember what I'm saying is how do you get started thinking about planning your fieldwork? Ask yourself, okay, forget the research question. How would I go about answering this subsidiary question? How would I go about achieving this objective? Okay, that can be a way to help you start working out exactly what tools, techniques, instruments you want to use. Okay, now that's about thinking about some practical considerations. I'm pretty sure all of you who've been here before, you've all done master's theses. You've done research, you have to have a sample, you have to do a population, you have to do research somewhere, someplace. Okay. So there's really four key things. In a methods section, when you're writing it, it's the sampling, where you're going to study the location, you have to write down the tools, techniques you're going to use, and also the time required to do it. I'm not saying anything new, I'm sure you've all been there, okay? But what I was saying earlier, when you face a blank page, oh, how on earth do I do this? One of the ways to get started is saying, okay, population sample, at least get the heading in. Location, where am I going to do this stuff? Once you've got a few headings, then you can start dealing with each one in turn. Okay, let's look at a study population and sample. Again, people go out and don't, it should be clear that you actually have to, I hope it's been driven into you at undergraduate level, and masters, to find your population. You have to draw a sample from a population. The way to do that is also then, how do you find your population? You have certain criteria. Maybe a population defined in terms, as I've just put somewhere up there, gender, sex, class, ethnicity, occupation, where they're located. So there's always a criteria by which you define the population. Once you've got those criteria, you say this is the population I'm looking at, then you can start saying, okay, how do I go about getting a sample from? One of the classical problems we face is, often we don't know the full size of the population. If, for example, okay, I'm just going to draw on Hertz research. The total population, well, actually, we do know roughly, but I sort of fair estimate. The population of female sex workers is global. Or the number of, say you're doing research on human resource management. How many human resource managers? Or more specifically, you're doing human resource management in companies over a certain size in this particular sector of the economy. Okay, you want to go out and talk to human resource managers within that population. You may or may not know. If you don't know, if you know the actual size of the population, you can then say, okay, I need to get a sample. Is it important to have a representative sample? Quite often, if you do that, you can work out if you're doing a quantitative survey, have some questionnaires, you can work out the sample. The problem with that for a PhD is if you suddenly find that there's 50,000 people in the population you want to study, and you go to a statistician and says, okay, how many, what does that thing do, by the way? It avoids, a statistician says, okay, to have a representative sample, you're going to need 700, a sample of 700 people. You might say, well, hang on, there's no ways in which I can do a questionnaire survey as a PhD student on 700 people. So you have to change your approach. Just the time, the logistics, the time it takes, okay? We do it fine. If you're working in a professional organization, HSRC, they do big household surveys. Herd, we do surveys with with sample sizes of over 1,700, because you've got the money, B, you've got the time, and C, we've got the resources. you set up with data collectors, research assistants, etc. You have a team. As a PhD student, you're not likely to have all those resources. Okay. More generally, what you're going to, as I've just sort of alluded to, you're probably going to choose a sample, a subgroup of a population, and it may be a case study to get an idea. You're not going to do necessarily a representative sample, in which case you're saying, look, this is not necessarily generalizable overall, but it's providing insights into issues, dynamics, whatever's going on within that particular population. Okay. Let me leave it at that. Sampling is something that you've got to think about. If it requires a huge sample, logistics are bad, you have to change, say, okay, I need to do the study in a different way. If it seems that I've got one way to do this requires me to do a questionnaire survey of 500 people, I won't have the time. May be feasible, it may not. Oh yeah, okay, where the location of the study. Okay, you want to obviously have to work out where you're actually going to do this study. In a lot of instances, you've got to, it can lead to its own logistics problems. You've got to think it through. If you want to give you an example, I put the issue of where's the best place to do research on miners. Well, research that we did was you actually do it in the mine. We did research up at Kuruman. That had huge logistical things. You've got to have the research team up there. They've got to be up at, I remember this, I wasn't involved, but it was middle of winter. They've got to be up at 4:30 to get to the mine. They've got to go through the security. It takes them an hour and stuff before they're even underneath the ground. And then basically by about 7 o'clock, they're able to start to go through the different tunnels to talk. And they've sampled miners, and then they've got to find the particular people that they need to talk to. Okay. Traders, think where you're going to do the work. Sex workers, the standard thing is, do you do the research on the street? Can do. It's potentially dangerous for you. I'll come to this later. It's not the right place either for the sex worker or yourself. Truck drivers. Generally, you have to say, okay, how on earth do I get to truck drivers? They're mobile. Quite often, a good way to get them is at the truck stops, border posts, whatever. All right, so the moment you say, I'm going to go and, okay, I'm going to study these people, where are those people? Then it's saying, okay, where would be the best place to study them? When's the best time in the day to do a survey? Another example. Anybody here want to tell me when's the best time of day to do research on homeless people in Durban? Anybody? At night. Homeless people are still too busy looking for food, trying to get money during the day. So, a colleague of mine was involved. They ended up doing research from about 10 o'clock at night onwards till about 2 in the morning. Okay. And it was finding, and a whole set of logistics to liaise, consult when, and then doing interviews where the homeless people gathered at night to sleep. And that was the best time to do the research. Okay. So, all I'm trying to get across is think through it. If you're involved in, say, management studies or whatever, you're doing research with something on companies, businesses, workers, managers, there's a whole set of negotiations there. Managers, factory workers have to be working. Managers don't like to see researchers in factories usually, because then the person is not working. Managers or administrators are busy. Usually you go out and say, okay, I want to do this. Talk to them. The best approach there in those situations is when would be an okay time for me to come and interview people? Okay, we're coming down to tools and techniques. In your design, on your study, you're either going to be able to have a quantitative study, possibly qualitative study. What sort of data do you want? Is it going to be quantitative data, something where you can do statistical analysis? Is it experiential data? By that I mean the way in which people respond to something, how they understand the world around them in relation to a particular set of issues. For example, if studying work with homeless people, it was both quantitative, there was a questionnaire, but there were also interviews on getting the experience of individual homeless people about how they live their lives, what is on different issues, finding money from discrimination, prejudice from the police, etc. One of the key things that you have to ask when you're choosing your technique is what sort of data does that technique get? Questionnaires, as I've said, allow you to get you defined information that allows you to do statistical analysis. Structured interviews can be used because they give you often there has to be a very clear answer in relation to the question. That may be combined with semi-structured where you allow people to elaborate, it becomes qualitative. Focus group discussions. I'll come on to that just now. It's actually, with that, I was going to talk about it just now. Focus group discussions. Anybody here used them?
I am planning to use them.
Okay. What sort of data do they give?
Sorry?
What sort of data do they give?
Kind of argumentative between the participants of the focus group discussions.
They give you, they give you generalized information, broadly within a group. There's limitations on what you get from it because you're getting from a group a sort of general, they'll give you disagreements, but they're very good for an overview. They're not good for detailed information. Okay. To take this a bit further, the logic of focus group discussions. I'll tell you why I'm going on to this, because it's the weakest form of data collection that is being used. And every MA student seems to want to use them. Okay, I've seen so many master's theses, they're going to do focus group discussions. The rationale for focus group discussions when it was first introduced is it's research you do to get an overview or an insight into an area or a set of issues before you start designing like questions for your questionnaire or whatever. Okay. They're very good as preliminary research. They're not good for in-depth research. Mainly because you can't, you've got 10 people in a room, 10 women asking it, you've got the individual experiences are often mixed up. You can't separate kind of what's prejudice, what's absolutely substantive. But they do help you to give you an insight into a range of issues. So focus group, that's what I'm saying, be careful. There's a rationale to every instrument. If you're not sure, and by the way, in terms of talking about guidelines, please just go onto Google. When you're trying to work it out, Google focus group discussions. They'll tell you, you can find stuff. even if you're using Wikipedia, but you'll find other documents that will help you think about and say, okay, this looks useful for me to use. So yeah, incorporate focus group discussions, but know exactly why you're incorporating and when is the right place in your research to do it. A variation on a focus group discussion, by the way, and I'm going to come to it just now, is using it as a type of feedback. You talk about, you present instruments, you say, listen, this is what I found out. Am I on the right track?
For conceptual validation of what I have been. That's
It's a start, yeah. I mean, it can help you validate, and certainly can help you get an idea. But rather than call it a focus group discussion, call it a feed. Well, it depends on where you're using it. I'm talking in terms of when you've done quite a lot of research, you've got results, and particularly if you're doing qualitative research. And in herd, for example, you know, we have a whole set of things. If you're doing research on difficult-to-reach population, men who have sex with men, intravenous drug users, pretty well any vulnerable people in the population, refugees. It's often qualitative about their experiences. You're trying to get insight into the challenges and realities of their life. You do the research, have a feedback work. You can do like a focus, use the sort of concept of a focus group discussion, where you present and say, look, this is what I think from all my discussions, my interviews, these seem to be the key challenges facing the population. And you use it in a way where people say, hey, whoa, you're way off track there, or yes, you're on the right track. So it can serve for that sort of purpose. My point, there's a rationale to using any particular method. And what I've got at the bottom there is actually sit down and write and say, okay, you've done some research online, you've read research methodology, books in the library, whatever, on tools and techniques. Write to yourself, okay, I'm going to use a questionnaire, it's appropriate because for these reasons. Write that out. Share it then with your supervisor who says, okay, yeah, this is it. And by the way, you keep those notes. Because when you have to write up your methods section in your thesis, you've already got half of it written. You'll rephrase it, of course, but you've already done a lot of the work on writing the text for a methods chapter. Oh yeah, time required to do the study. Okay, you're already theoretically, or in principle, you're involved in a 3-year process. In principle, as I'm saying, 1 year to prepare your proposal, 1 year to do the research, 1 year to write up. There are variations in different disciplines. But if you're saying, okay, that really I should allow about a year for doing my actual research, whether you're going through big databases or whether you're doing field work, it may actually only be 6 months. You may want to give yourself more time for the writing up. But preliminary planning, draw a Gantt chart. Anybody here not know what a Gantt chart is? Everybody's done one. Okay. All right, it's standard procedure. Okay, but as I'm saying, with you have to write one up for your proposal anyway. But for the fieldwork planning, write another one that starts from the point of approval, of ethics approval, to then, okay, preliminary research, the different things that you've got to do. And when you're planning it, sampling, you can write things down, sampling. You've got an idea of how long, say, doing focus group discussions will take. 2 months for that, 3 months for this, whatever. You write again. Gantt charts help you start to put things in order. And actually they're a very good way to start organizing your plan. So you actually, and you just refine it as you go along. And I'll show that just shortly. Okay, just a summary. You're planning your research, your research plan, your field work. You can reduce it down to who, what, where, when, why, how. Thinking ahead, when you've all done your theses and you're now starting to write articles, you have to write a method section in your article. And you'll find the biggest problem is that you've got 6,000 words to write your article, and the hardest thing to write is to write the method section in other words, give yourself you don't want to spend too much time on methods. You want to write it within 1,000 words, sometimes like a page. And it's very difficult to get enough detail down. But if you think of who, what, why, where, when, sampling, design, data collection, storage, you can, it's how you go about writing a method section for an article. But just keep that in mind when you're writing your research plan, fieldwork plan for your thesis. Okay, we're about halfway through. That's the start. What I've covered there is the basics. It's what gets you going. So you can reach a point where you can say, right, I'm doing questionnaire, I'm doing semi-structured interviews, I'm using a sample of 50 people, I'm doing it in Durban, I'm doing it in wherever, working in factories, whatever. Once you've got the basics, then you have to start refining it, tightening it up, taking into account things, logistics, and really making it much tighter. Devising a research plan is an iterative process. Get the basics done first, as I'm saying, because once you have that, you've got a foundation. Then you can start improving it. As I've said there, once you've got the basics, you'll refine it, taking into account new things to do. And I'm going to cover those things now. Yeah, okay, here's one of the classic issues to address. Do you have research subjects or do you have participants? If you say, well, the participants in my research are this, then saying the word participants means that they are involved in your study in some way. As I've got back there. If they're subjects, they are just the subjects of your research. They are not involved in any way beyond being sources of information. You go out, you deliver a questionnaire, they give you the information, you say thank you very much, and you go away. If you're saying they're participants, they will be involved, they should be involved in some way in even the design of the study. Verifying your result, validating your results. Okay, so be careful of the terms that you use. So you might have your basic draft and you say you're going to do this, and you say, well, I'm actually going to have some feedback workshops. Going back to my example, research with difficult to reach populations, many have sex with men, drug users, sex workers. Often the only way to do research is to design the research in collaboration with them. Part of it is the politics of it. There's been so much research on sex workers. They're sick and tired of researchers coming through to them. So they want some research that may be of use. That they want to say, well, okay, what use is this research to me? And that's where the researcher has to engage and work out and say, okay, look, I want to do research on this field, and people will come around to saying, okay, yes, if we can use that research for our purposes, then we're happy to get involved. Okay. So, and participants, bear in mind that just the word participant there's a logical foundation to it, so the principle of reflexivity. You can check that up online, the principle. It's actually a very old, well, it's from sociology, but it's been used for years by anthropologists. That the idea that when you go out to do a study, actually talking to people, getting them to help with the design of the study, the focus, the issues that you're dealing with, talking about the results that you have can improve a researcher's, the quality of the research that you're doing. That's goes back onto a theoretical framework of constructivist theory. All I'm trying to show is that from my original point, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to go out and do some interviews, or I'm going to do a questionnaire, a focus group discussion. How you define the people you're going to interview as subjects or participants. If you decide to involve, if they are participants, they're engaged in the research. There's a rationale built within the notion of a research participant. That is of reflexivity, which, if you read further, goes back to questions and discussions within science about objectivity of knowledge, etc. So there is a link between whatever technique you use or tool and some form of scientific theory way deep down. Yes, okay. Please, this is actually why I've put it in red. Devising the questions. How have I phrased it there? Learn the difference between questions about the type of information you want and questions you actually ask individuals to get that information. Your first draft of the questions that you want to do in the interview are likely to be the type of information you want. So say, for example, you're doing research research on changes in human resource management practices as a result of legislation and over a certain number of years. I bet you I've actually seen illustrations of this, but somebody goes out and says, okay, I'm going to ask this HR manager, how have HR practices changed in the last few years? That's not a question you ask. Anybody want to tell me why? It's the type of information you want. You're trying to get information on how HR practices have changed. It's not to get that, yeah.
I think it's actually the way you can phrase better so that it doesn't lead.
Yeah.
It actually enables a person to explain what has been happening.
Well, there's no specification in relation to what, or as a result of what. You'd have to ask, the question you would ask is saying, well, in relation to this legislation, questions like, did it have an effect immediately? Did that legislation lead to changes straight away? What management practices actually changed? In what management practices were specifically linked to the introduction of that legislation? You end up asking probably a dozen questions to get the information, to get the type of information you want. It can. I see this all the time. There's nothing wrong with writing in your first draft of your interview schedule to just write the questions. But then say, okay, is this the question I actually asked a person, or is the question that I've written actually about the type of information I want to get? Okay, he's not here now. I was just talking to someone just before I came in. It's on decentralization of health system, and we're working through this issue. Now he wants to talk to people involved in the policy level and district level on decentralization of healthcare in the country. He's got a question. Please tell me, what were the critical incidents, positive or negative, with regard to decentralization of the healthcare system? I'm saying, okay, critical incidents in the process of decentralization of the healthcare system is information you want. But you don't just ask a person that. You've got to ask a question and say, okay, at a national level, somebody who is involved in policy, when you were devising this, when you were planning decentralization of the healthcare system, what were the steps that were taken? With regard to decentralization of financial management, what steps were taken? What were the first challenges that you faced? Were there disagreements amongst national policy makers on human resource management? No, you would have to cover decentralization in terms of human resources for health, financial management, procurement, everything. You'd probably end up having, and then you've got to say, okay, once the policy is made, you have a whole set of questions on the implementation of that policy. Again, a whole set of questions to try and find out where were the challenges, where were the roadblocks, critical, if you're defining critical instances, key things that happen. You might have 10, a whole set of questions you ask somebody at national level. You might have related questions, but different questions you'd ask somebody at district management level. You see what I'm getting at? And then out of all that information, you'd be able to write in the end and say, okay, at this particular time, during the formulation of the policy, whatever you're saying, really mean by critical incident, the critical issues were in relation to devolution of financial management. So, yeah,
and as you were talking, I was thinking the questions that the example that you're giving is related to structured interview, same structure.
It would be, yeah, if it was a structured interview. In this instance, we're talking probably about a structured interview. I want to come on next. It would be, in fact, what we're moving towards is a preliminary interview where you get an overview, plus introduce yourself to a policymaker or somebody who's involved at that time, recognizing they're very busy. Make yourself known, you've made an introduction. They're busy people, you're asking them for half an hour in their day. But they now know you, you're in a position to then go back and say, look, can I come back and talk to you and do a more detailed interview? And having gotten, once they sort of understand what you're on about, you can go back and do the structured interview. It might even lead to a third one, because you say, well, now I've got all this information, but it's quite clear from my structured interviews, I'm not quite sure what happened with regards to the recent changes in policy with regards to decentralization or changes in human management practices in a company. So you go back with a semi-structured interview and say, look, the last time we spoke, you mentioned this, this, and this. Can you elaborate? What did you mean by that? That's what I'm saying. This is refined. This is a research process. If you're doing a PhD, going in and doing one interview, or I'm going to go and interview 20 people, and that's my data, it really won't work. The chances are you're going to do one set of interviews, analyze the data, go back with a refined set of questions, and you may even do three sets of interviews. You may, depending on the type of the research project you're doing, you do a whole lot of interviews, structured, semi-structured. At the end, you have a very clear idea, and then you go out to that population and you do a questionnaire. One of my first things, the professors, when I was doing my PhD in anthropology, sorry about this, they said, this is the rule. You never do a questionnaire until you're about to leave the field. So in those days we were supposed to do 2 years field work. That's ethnography, it just takes time. But the sort of, okay, I'm saying a rule, it's not an absolute one, but the point being was that saying, listen, you're walking into an area as an anthropologist. I did my research in Lesotho. You don't know what questions, you really don't know what questions to ask or put in a questionnaire until you've been there for a couple of years and actually know about the place and everything. Then you're in a position to devise a questionnaire to get particular information on particular issues that you've covered, and with the possibility of some quantifying the qualitative information you got. So, for example, in my case, not that I did it, but a lot of it was on chieftainship in Lesotho. In essence, why do anybody here from Lesotho? Okay, maybe I'm on safe ground, but essentially, I had two fundamental questions. What is a chief and what does a chief do? But equally, why, when you go anywhere in Lesotho, people rubbish chiefs, marenga? So no, they're just hopeless waste of time. And then you say, well, should we get rid of Serena, the institution of chieftainship? And people say, whoa. Chiefs may be bad, but they're not as bad as civil servants. And they're not as bad as this democracy that they've introduced, these village development committees who are completely corrupt. Put crudely, rather, we prefer the devil we know than the one we don't. Chiefs you can work. They can be drunkards, occasionally you might get a good one, but at least we have the same frame of reference. We know how to work with them. Okay. So, in principle, I did have an idea that having got all the research, I could then go out and devise a questionnaire to be used with Ramotsi, village headmen, ward chiefs, and higher chiefs to get particular data on issues of chieftainship authority that would give me some ability to do some quantitative, some descriptive statistical analysis. So, okay, again, it's we've deviated a bit. My point there is when you're refining your research, you start with the idea, interviews, questionnaire, whatever, but it can end up being saying, okay, it's several sets of interviews. It's a questionnaire at this point. It's a focus group discussion at this point. And as I was saying earlier, as you work out how you're going to do the research, you end up adding more things to do, and then obviously refine your Gantt chart, because that will help, insert new things to do so that you keep track of all basically the logistics of your field work. Okay, bit of a long time on that, but don't feel that you've always got to completely invent new questions. As I was saying earlier, if there are PhDs, theses, research reports, the full ones will have copies of the questionnaires, of interview schedules. PhD theses, certainly. Go and check them out. You can maybe use the same questions, or some of the questions, in your own schedules. If you're doing this thing, there are tested and validated questions for particular phenomena. I don't know if anybody's here, for example, if you're doing whether people are depressed or not. I've done 2 sets of research amongst caregivers of orphans in Amajuba district and research in relation to an intervention in Swaziland with adolescents. One of the things we wanted to find out was levels of self-esteem within, and also depression. There are validated, tested sets of questions to help you find out, the type of question you want to find out. For example, caregivers, we know that they struggle materially bringing up lots of, I'm talking about grandmothers, grandchildren, They suffer, health problems. Some of it is mental health problems. We need to do some questions with regards to mental health stresses. We could use questions related to depression that have been tried and tested. But there was about 6 questions, by the way, or 6 sets of questions in order to be able to say anything about the mental state or mental stresses of caregivers. And that's the difference between the type of information we wanted was on mental stresses, depression. You use a whole set of different sets of questions to get that information. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, I'm going to take you slightly back.
Yeah.
I was hoping that I would get the opportunity time to ask, so I guess.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. My research is, it involves petroleum companies in Zimbabwe, right? Basically what I want to do is I'm looking at management accounting techniques as a means for competitive advantage, right? Okay. Yeah, that's basically the whole idea, the general idea. So it will involve me getting information from private companies, pure companies, and I must say it's a highly regulated environment, and also highly politicized.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one way that we could do about it, I was having a discussion with my supervisor, and she had advised that I get to go through a gatekeeper, which is like the industry regulatory board, as a means to get access to this particular, private companies. What I'm asking, what I want to learn from your vast experience, is how do you maneuver, how do you get to penetrate these companies, get the information that you want. Some of it might be sensitive in regard, maybe I'm going to ask about how they are performing against a competitive environment. How do you deal with that? How do you handle that? A practical way of doing it.
Yeah, okay. So I was going to cover that earlier. There's a thing called scoping research. But a standard procedure is where there's a possibility, in a lot of research in health, you have to have consultations beforehand. There's a consultative stage. The jargon in consultancy world is stakeholder consultation. Quite often there are always gatekeepers. If I know anybody from the field of health here, if you want to do research, even social science research, say in a hospital, you have to get national level Ministry of Health approval, provincial Ministry of Health approval, before the hospital manager will even let you in. Okay. You can't just walk up to a hospital to the manager and say, listen, I want to do some research here. They'll say, get lost. We need approval. It happens in different fields. The route that you're suggesting is through the regulator. Again, it depends. Oh, I'm going to be on dangerous ground here. It depends the type of research you're doing, how political and sensitive it is, okay? There are ways but yes, it's a serious consideration in your case. Is the regulator the right way to go about it? Because if that regulator is a highly politicized body, they may be the first ones to block you, or they'll make it difficult. Or the people you want to speak to who say, hang on, you spoke to them, we don't trust them one bit. So you've got to be, you either come in from the top or you come in from the bottom. But what I want to get to, look, I can't give you an answer, but yes, there would be other bodies. There must be professional. Another way around it is approach, I don't know the types of companies, but approach for general, to the CEO of each company. Ask for a discussion saying, this is what I want to do. Could I get approval to come to your company? could I have a meeting with you and, that, whether, there may be competitors, but CEOs do meet. Whether you can meet a group of them and saying, I want to do this. That's coming in partly way at the top through head management, because obviously to get approval there, then they tell what other people to do. But what you're raising is, look, there's no single answer, but it's the sort of scoping research to say, this is going to be difficult to get into. How do I do it? And it's pretty well any research topic. Say you wanted to look at the business accounting practices of those businesses that are importing heroin into South Africa. Pretty difficult topic.
Yeah.
But you could work out a way to do it. Maybe dangerous. And you'd have to consider feasibility in terms of your own security and that. But I mean, look, I had one, we didn't actually imply it, was at one stage with a sociologist, it was really about what is the extent and scale and the reasons for massive livestock theft between Lesotho and South Africa across the Drakensberg border. You can't just walk up and say, okay, we do need to speak to livestock thieves. How do we get to livestock thieves? Well, probably the only ones we can speak to are those who are in prison. So there was a design of the research saying, okay, if we're to get to the prison, we're going to need approval from the Department of Correctional Services, etc., etc. And even then, you're talking to a prisoner, are they going to be interested to talk to us? What I'm saying is you just have to think through, what I'm saying is, in reality, you have 7 or 8 ideas and you've got to work through the implications of what each idea would be, how you get through the gatekeepers, and then working out what would be the most feasible one. There is a way. Okay. Yeah, okay. So it's interesting. Oh, I just wanted to mention, if you are anybody doing anything on households or rural areas, I'm not sure, the issue of household wealth. There's been dozens of surveys, research on rural incomes, how do you measure household wealth in a rural area? There's standard questions for assessing household wealth in rural areas. You don't have to, in other words, you don't have to think it through yourself. So my point would be, look through studies, PhD theses, reports, check check what they've got in terms of their actual tools and techniques. Ask where, in certain studies, like if you're doing for household wealth, through supervisor, go to economics, sociology departments. There'll be somebody who can say, oh, that type of stuff, and guide you in the right direction. Oh, this is where I was at. Your point, let's just do this, sorry. What I'm saying, refining your study, you might find that you need to do a whole set of different things to do. Scoping research. Scoping research, a bit like what you're saying here, is preliminary research, including field visits, to assess the feasibility and factors to take into account in the research plan. Being up in Zimbabwe and trying to work out, okay, who do I go to first? How do I even get in there? That would fall under scoping. Okay. That gets built into your research plan. Gets built into your Gantt chart. And you might then have, what I'm saying is very practical, is because you might say, okay, I need to allow a month to do this in Zimbabwe. Pilot studies. They're often used in big surveys where you've got questionnaires, where you're testing the instrument you're using, questionnaire intelligence, schedule phrasing of questions, and also for the time it takes. Every one of you should actually do a pilot study in some way if you're going to interview people. You may go out and I don't know who you're going to interview, but say in management you are going to be interviewing senior managers in the corporate sector on this. You have a nice questionnaire, you go in there, and after 45 minutes the guy says, listen, well, I've given you enough time, I'm a busy man or woman, I can't, and you're only halfway through the questionnaire. You know, it's quite dangerous to have a questionnaire or an interview schedule that's going to, an interview that's going to take an hour and a half time from somebody who may not have that. I haven't done it myself, but we've, you know, in hospital research, interviews with doctors are very hard. They'll say, yeah, listen, I've got half an hour, come sit down. 10 minutes later, there's an emergency. They're up and gone, so sorry. Come back next week. What I'm saying is you do test out your instruments. If you're working in, well, certainly working with different populations. Give you an example, research on orphans, AIDS orphans, this was early 2000s in Amajuba. We had a whole set of questionnaire working with children. We did a pilot study and we had to completely revamp. We had all the questionnaires translated into Zulu. The problem was it was translated into formal Zulu, which is not the language that, and we were dealing with kids from 9 years to 17. When you're talking about issues of illness, HIV, sexuality, kids do not use formal language, they use slang. And the slang that 9 to 12-year-olds use is different. You know, the language for kissing is different from what we found. The word used for kissing is different for a 9 to 12-year-old compared to the older teenagers. Okay? So there's a whole change, you know, on that sort of thing. What I'm trying to say, it's whatever language you talk, you know, obviously, you know, you might be doing research in any one of several languages. It's a matter of testing to see that the term, that the way in which you may think, you know, I'm Zulu, Xhosa, Ranat, I can write the questions myself, but you don't know whether the language that you've used is appropriate in that area. You all know better than I do. In Zulu, you can have dialects or kind of language that will be slightly different terms in one part, you know, in one part of the case again compared to another. Okay, so the problem, you know, you do that, you do pilot test language phrasing, because if you don't get it, if you're not using a term that people understand immediately, you're not going to get a good answer. You're not going to get the information that you need. Okay. And again, yeah, at that point, testing for the time it takes. Data verification. However good your plan, and when you go out into the field, and it doesn't matter whether, if you're doing management studies in corporate sectors, there will be, you need to allow time where you've spoken to people and they say, yeah, no, there was a whole, you know, say you're doing something in business. Oh no, there was a whole inquiry or a whole set of issues. It was well written about. There was an industrial watchdog wrote on this 10 years ago. You've got to go and hunt for those documents. There will be, somebody will say, listen, I don't know, I really don't know much, but the person who you really should talk to, but he or she's retired, they're actually living here, you really need to speak to them. You have to adapt, okay? Allow for time to adapt to the information that you learn in the field. And it's partly verification, because if you get documentation to support verbal information, that's always good. Validation procedures. there's a whole range of validation. I suggest you, talk, some of you have done it. I just want to cover. Validation is, we covered it a little bit, where you might use a feedback workshop where you present some of your results, and you can use that. We've used it before. To give you an example, we were doing research on community and home-based care programs in 4 countries in Africa. We were working with NGOs in that field. We got a whole lot of information that was showing how those community and home-based care programs basically evolved over time from purely doing home-based care, palliative care for people with HIV. Once treatment came in, to assisting people to get treatment, and by 2010, in a lot of places have elaborated, because they're quite, they've been working for 20 years. They were doing elderly care. They were doing support groups. They weren't focusing on treatment, they were doing on social and economic support for people. We had a whole lot of information. What we did then in 2 countries was saying, okay, these are results, the way in which most NGOs have evolved, and a lot of them now, the ones we've researched, include like social support programs, this, that. We then devised a short questionnaire which we sent to a cross-section of NGOs in the field that we haven't in the same each country, well, we did in 2 countries. A cross-section of like 20 to 30 NGOs working in the same field, say one was in Malawi, and said, look, we'd be grateful. These are the results. To what extent do you agree that many NGOs now in community home-based care programs are doing social support interventions built into their projects? Do you do social support? What type of social support do you do? I'm saying I had 3 questions to get information. From that, we got validation because they all wrote back and said, no, we agree. This is what we're doing. So it was a way of validating. We'd worked with, say, 4 NGOs. We approached 15 to 20 that we hadn't covered across the country. They agreed, they validated the results. We used them to validate our own results. It was one way to help validate. Okay. I'm not going to go any further than that. Please look online. Just type in validation of data. There are lots of ways. Different ways. It will vary according to the type of research that you do. Okay. And I'm not talking, by the way, here. There's obviously the one of validation when you're doing statistical analysis. You're doing that. There's a different set of procedures for that.
Sorry, can I? If you are dealing with a sample frame with different characteristics. How you're planning to do a pilot study? Like, for example, if you wanted to do a pilot test, I'm sorry, that's because your phone is next to the microphone.
Yeah, sorry?
That's because your cell phone is next to the microphone.
Oh, is that it?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm a bit of a dinosaur with technology.
So let's say if you wanted to do a pilot test of the interview questions that you have proposed, but the sample frame you have a quite different samplings inside with the different characteristics. How are we going to plan to do a pilot test?
But would that be where you're asking a similar set of questions to a bunch of people, a sample of people who are very different?
Yes.
Well, you'd still apply that. You'd still do that with say 2 or 3 of, not in your sample, but 2 or 3 people who aren't included in the study of each character, and say, does this interview work with everyone?
So it's better to do it individually?
Individually, definitely. Yeah. What I'm saying is, for example, we had that thing in Amajuba district with talking to children 9 to 17 years old. We did deliberately, took 6, 9 to 12-year-olds, we actually took a cross-section of, I think if I remember correctly, ages. And from that we suddenly realized, whoa, this questionnaire doesn't really work. It doesn't work at all, because the kids are saying, what do you mean by that? On sexual intercourse or kissing. Oh, yes, you mean that. It's the slang word. And so that's and what we realized was different terms for different ages. But that was through doing a cross-section, the same questionnaire with a cross-section on age with the kids. Whatever the characteristics, you almost have to, if you've got a diverse range, then you almost need to do it, find 1 or 2 people who are not in the study of the characteristics. Because I would say right at the start, there's a good, I don't know what characteristics you're looking at, but there's a good chance that it won't necessarily work for everyone. Or you must be, that's where it's a good reason to do it's a small pilot. It's just testing whether the questions, the way we phrase the questions and the questions we ask have the same meaning to a sample that includes people with very different characteristics. I'm talking, I don't know what they are, but assuming big differences in age, ethnicity, whatever. Okay, my point in red there, if you need any of the above, so then your research plan should be done in phases. You have a preliminary phase, scoping, whatever. You will have a second phase, pilot study, and then you will have a third phase of main body of research, and the fourth phase may be validation research. What I'm saying is your plan needs to be structured in an order. It won't, and it's worth thinking, and it's always with a PhD thesis worth thinking about just planning and researching. There's different types of research being done to serve a particular purpose. Each one has a particular purpose. A pilot study has a particular purpose. A scoping study has a particular purpose. And it's all done in sequence in order to ensure that you get the depth and detail of the data that you need. And as I put at the bottom, refine the Gantt chart. Because you're going to be lost in writing all this out. Gantt chart's a very nice tabular format. You can put things in and then start working out, okay, how much time do I need to do this? Okay. Some practical stuff to think about. Data collection technology. Because I'm talking about a research plan, and there's obviously a thing where you've got data, the research plan includes data analysis and data storage and all that. But the way in which you do research, sometimes it's face-to-face interviews. A lot of qualitative research uses tape recordings or audio recording. If you're doing audio recording, it then means having time for, are you going to do full transcription of the interviews? That then involves you in a method of having to code that data. Again, there are tools for that. So even the technology has certain implications for the research procedure that you do. The one that I've got there, self-administered questionnaires. If you're doing research on very sensitive topics, For example, interviews on intimate partner violence, gender-based violence from victims. You have to consider sometimes the difficulty that people will be happy to answer questionnaires, but not directly to a person in front of them, even if they are a woman or whatever. But that says, look, I'm not even going to be in the interview room. Here's a tablet, here's the questionnaire, questions. Please answer as you can. That information goes to, I forgot what they call it. Can anybody say what it's familiar with? I've forgotten the name. But anyway, that information then just goes to a central database. And you can assure the person you interviewed or the researcher can say, listen, I will know only that there's X number of people who will have a code name for each set of interviews, but I won't know who in particular answered which questionnaire or interview schedule. Okay. I'm saying just the data technology these days has implications for how you're planning and for data analysis. There are things you take into account in terms of regarding feasibility of doing research. That technology I'm talking about is very good when you're dealing with, say, very sensitive topics where you're asking people, like intimate partner violence, where you're asking people to reveal information that causes them hurt. It then has implications for your data analysis procedures. As I said, like audio recording means that you're then doing transcripts. If you're doing full transcripts, then you have to use the techniques of coding to be able to draw out particular themes. I'm not going to go into it. Anybody here familiar with that, Daniel? Okay, just trust me. I'm saying that. You can check it out if you want. Data storage procedure. It's always about safety and security. I just want to touch on the one. Okay, stuff has to be secure. Stuff has to be confidential. But to reiterate Prof. Whitman's point, the very normal one, please make sure that you have copies of everything. In my life, I'm a dinosaur. My first research, we didn't have laptops or anything. When I started PhD, everything was handwritten. I had notebooks, but I bought triplicate notebooks. So all my field notes, it was good. The triplicates, I don't really see them anymore. Every time I left, say, to come back to Durban after 4 or 5 weeks up in Khotla, I would bring down the two, from the triplicate pages, I'd bring down 2 copies. One I stored at Westville campus in the office, one I stored in my flat. Oh, no. The other one was I was doing it through UCT. One set I sent by courier, courier, the safest courier, to the anthropology department in Cape Town. In other words, so I have data in 3 different places. These days, you have your laptop, your PC, you have a hard drive, portable hard drive, the laptop is with you, the portable hard drive with everything is in a room where you live, and when you update, when you go home, when you visit your parents or something, you copy it onto, you have a third copy, you copy it on somewhere else, or a friend's house. You have, I'm saying, keep 3 sets of copies in 3 different places. Jim's been, people lose data, okay, it happens. You do not want to be in a situation where you're driving along, whenever you walk into a shop, you're doing it quickly, you're carrying your laptop with you, you put it down, it's swiped. You've lost something. The Zambian colleague had 2 months of field data, happened to live out of his office, happened to be the day a thief walked into those offices. He had to repeat 2 months field work. Like he had everything else, but he hadn't backed up his field work for 2 months. Yeah.
Also assists to email yourself.
That's what I'm saying. Jim mentioned the other way. Yeah, I mean, there are techniques, but He emphasized it, I emphasized it, because you do not want to end up losing formats of field data or even when you come to write up, you do not want to lose the only draft with 5 chapters that you've written. Okay. Draft chapters, write copies of. Final chapters, at least 3 copies in 3 separate places. Okay, cover this up. Research ethics, we're almost there. Everything is fine. I know that you have gone through this university policy, on ethics procedures, you get voluntary informed consent and everything like that. But bear in mind that once you've worked out how to do your study, and if you've changed it and refined it, look, what are the ethical implications? I'm just giving you a very simple example there. If you planned and you were making sure you're only going to talk to adults, and suddenly you realize, okay, actually I do need in this study to talk to people under 18 years old, you're immediately in the terrain of doing research with children, because they're not legally adults. That then has ethics implications. You have to build in certain procedures. If you're doing research in locations, you want to do research, like I was saying, it's research that was being done amongst homeless people. There is the question, obviously the researchers are worried about security. They move in teams. There's a lot of negotiation beforehand where they walk into an area where there's a section, a location where homeless people are speaking. They've already prepared the ground. There's already 3 or 4 kind of spokespeople for the homeless people who live there who can vouch for these researchers being there. Okay. As mentioned, research with interviews with female sex workers. For all sorts of reasons, it's usually best to be done at a safe place. We did some in Durban through a clinic that works with sex workers, specifically in Warwick Junction. We interviewed them in those premises. If you're doing any questions that could cause distress to people, so if you're doing any, like a lot of health research, if you're doing research on HIV or anything, experiences with vulnerable people, you're asking sensitive information or experiences of prejudice, discrimination, whatever. It could cause, any question that could cause distress, you immediately then have to have an adverse event management procedure. So for example, it would need a referral to a qualified counsellor. In a lot of instances, you'd have actually potentially, your researchers have to be trained counsellors in some of this. We tried to do some, not PhD, we were trying to do some research on female sex workers about 10 years ago. We didn't do it because we didn't have the funding, because the requirement was saying, what happens if you're out on the street, you're talking to female sex workers, and you come across a 16-year-old sex worker? By law, you have to immediately refer them to child protection. You're also in a situation where there should be counselling. The researchers have to be trained, but you need actually a psychologist on hand. The project didn't have the funding to have a psychologist available at pretty much at the moment status for counselling. So that's sort of, they all have those implications. Okay. Right, just a final thing I want to pick up on. This is just, as I put in red at the bottom, do the online courses for ethics and do attend the research ethics lecture next week. There are, if you are out anywhere doing research, interviewing people, and it can seem the most innocuous situation, you're talking to managers, you're talking to administrators, or as opposed to the sort of situation where I've been talking about with ethical challenges in the field for doing research with sex workers or refugees. If you have an adverse event, sometimes you encounter a situation where you're caught in a difficult situation. You have to have, for example, an informant breaks down and starts crying. Is seriously distressed. You have, and again, most research in that situation, you have a procedure to cover that sort of situation. But I'm talking where it might be you get political interference from gatekeepers or whatever. You have to be able to, I can't define what it is. What I'm saying is you reach situations, you can get in situations where you feel caught. There's no obvious right or wrong answer in a particular situation. You have to make a decision to solve it, and an ethical decision is a wise decision. It is based upon the principles of ethical research, and you have to, the decision has to be based on that and flow right through to being the logic of that rationale being expressed in the decision you actually make. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is if you do get caught in an awkward situation, and you'll find, for example, on your voluntary consent forms, you have to give the name of the university ethics office, you have to give the names and contact details. If there's a complaint against you, the university will investigate. Depending on the seriousness of it, let me go out on a limb here. Remember, the university is trying to protect reputation. You may have defense from people from the ethics board. You made a mistake, it wasn't intentional, but there's still damage to the reputation of the university. The lawyers will step in. If there's going to be a scapegoat, believe me, you are the weakest person there. You will be the scapegoat. Right? I'm just saying this, please be careful. The whole point is, understand research ethics, understand why they're in place, make sure you have ethical procedures built in, and it can be just sort of in a way to end off. I'll give you an example that I was involved in that could have cost me my career. We were doing research in Cato Manor with school children. One of the things where we're saying, okay, for the time they're involved, they can have, there was an incentive. They got a sandwich and a fruit juice in the morning, and then we said, okay, there can be a treat in the afternoon. We're talking 200 or 300 kids at the time. We discussed it with the teachers and the children. They said, no, KFC. So we said, fine, a treat is a treat. KFC, street, what do you call it?
Streetwise two.
Sorry, streetwise two. Fine, 20 logistics was a bit heavy. The mistake, what happened one day, the caterer that we were using was hauling 300 streetwise packets into the grounds. There was a near riot. The researchers had to blockade themselves in the classroom and hand it out through windows. And teachers were running for it as well. The mistake was our perception of streetwise 2 as a treat. In that context of poverty, KFC is not a treat. It's a luxury that they can never have. No, they don't come from families that can afford to buy that sort of treat. It was it's like a luxury product, and of course people were going crazy over it. Now, if one child got in that stampede, if one child had fallen over, got hurt, badly injured or whatever, when you've got people rushing in, like a mob, people can get hurt. I think it would be very difficult to say, listen, we just made a mistake. We didn't realize that, wasn't just about giving a treat, it was giving something that was unavailable, that people really hardly, well, would love to have when they got together. In which case they would have said that your experienced researchers should know better. And we would have said. So what I'm saying, you crop up in the most others ways, and you have to be carefully think through your actions. Okay, conclusion. Just that, look, the PowerPoint is going to go, obviously be available, but yeah, planning your research or fieldwork takes time. As I said right at the beginning, it's not just a matter of saying, fine, I'm going to do some interviews and this and that in front of people. It's an iterative process. It's a constant process. You refine it, you get a basic draft, and then you add to it as you realize, thinking of things, do I need a pilot study? Do I need to check the feasibility of it? Your tools, techniques must reflect the logic and aim of the study. They're appropriate to get the relevant, detailed, in-depth data which you actually need. Okay. Some instances, focus group discussion is what you need at the beginning of the study. It's not going to get you the information, in-depth, detailed information. And I've just put in 2 questions at the bottom. When refining the plan, they're just questions you ask yourself. Is this the research fieldwork plan or even a component of it appropriate according to the criteria of my research question, the methodological framework, and the quality and type of data I want? And likewise, is it feasible according to criteria of cost and time? So I know, so you mentioned, at the front you mentioned you get working petroleum industries, having to check out feasibility. It may become easy to do, but you have to work out in terms of feasibility, how long it will take, how much it will cost. Okay, appreciate that gone on a bit of time, gone on a bit. Any questions? All right, thank you. As I've said, they're guidelines. And I think what Jim said, what he was trying to do, there are ways to think about how to sort out your research plan. Okay, right from that one I was saying, look at the references you read in your literature review to get ideas, through to the detailed stuff like when you do a pilot study, how you do validation of data, etc. Yeah.
I'm trying to think, in case of maybe a study where you collect data from sex workers.
Yeah.
Is the gender of the researcher important? Because I'm thinking, what if the sex worker sees you as a client? Are those possibilities there?
It's actually it's a contestable point. Two issues, by the way. One with focus group discussions. One, generally it's assumed that it's better to have a woman who's doing interviews with female sex workers. There was some stuff in Zimbabwe where they said in certain areas it didn't work. Actually, it was better having a man. The other one, that point about focus group discussions, where they had a problem, they wanted to have a focus group discussion, so they got women from sex workers from one area to talk about things. It didn't work because what they were drawing in was a group of women who are competitors. And so for very practical in that thing, like no one is prepared to talk honestly about HIV because they're not going to let any other sex worker know that they are HIV or on treatment. One of the best ways to bring down one of your competitors is to tell clients, so no, she's HIV positive. When you're fighting for clients, you see what I mean? And this was, so it was saying, do not form a focus group discussion amongst these women from one location, maybe from different towns, where they're not actually competitors. And these things come up sometimes because they're not even things you thought about beforehand. And then you have to change your tactics. point. Those lectures next week, they'll be on slightly different issues, but like I said, the research ethics lecture, it's important, not just on learning about research ethics, it's about the implications of the ethics in terms of how you plan the study. You know, certain types of research among certain people require certain different procedures for ethical purposes. Changes your research plan. Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you.